Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Aristotle's Politics. I've had a couple days off because of some holidays and things like that. Also some other issues. We're back now. We're continuing where we left off, which was on. Of course, you guys don't know this because I pre-tape these, and therefore you haven't had a break. Today we're looking at chapter 6 of book 2. It's still focusing on Plato. We finished the early chapters, the last couple of chapters, focusing on um, Plato's Republic, which was again this whole chapter. Book 2 is about regimes finally. He's going to look at the accounts of the accounts of regimes that are considered to be best, finally, beautifully administered. And uh, at first, it seems like he's not talking about actual regimes, but then he focuses on regimes in speech, particularly for focusing on Plato's Republic. Now he's turning from the Republic to Plato's laws in this chapter, chapter 6. And it has only one chapter, unlike the very long discussions of on the Republic, which tended to almost be from the start. Chapter 1, even though chapter 1 starts something else, the more general topic, but general chapter 2, 3, and 4, 2, 3, 4, and 5 all deal with the Republic. Now, to chapter 6, we're going to be looking at the laws. And he starts out very similarly in the case of the laws, which was written later. So it is best to investigate briefly the regime there as well. So we're going to be looking at that the regime. Now he argues that it's a later writing. It's like this. In the Republic, after all, Socrates discussed very few matters. In other words, how things should stand concerning the community and women and children, property, and arrangement of the regime. For he divides the mass of inhabitants in two parts, the farmers and the military part, and from these a third is the deliberative and authoritative part of the city. That's the original city, right? That's the original in the Republic. As for farmers and artisans, whether they take part in rule to some extent or not at all, or whether they should possess arms and join in warfare to themselves, is nowhere discussed by Socrates. Yet he supposes that women should join in warfare and share in the same education as the guardians. Otherwise, he has filled out the argument with extraneous issues, particularly concerning what sort of education the guardian should have. So, in other words, he doesn't really talk about the regime per se. He talks about more. It's a criticism saying that the Republic is not really about the regime. It's not about. It's not really an analysis of a regime. Its name is that, but it isn't really that. It doesn't really get into details of the. It gets into a lot of issues about education and things like this, and not enough about the nature of the city and the institutions, and ignores significant portions. That's the criticism he raised earlier. So continue. He kind of sums that up again, right? Now he says the laws deal with the most part. Deals with, for the most part, with laws, and little is said about the regime. So therefore, it's interesting. Exactly, that's the name. The name, the nomos, the laws, right? And it focuses on the laws, whereas the republic is about the regime. But he doesn't. This is hilarious, right? As to this, although he wishes to make it more attainable by cities, he gradually brings it around again towards the other regime of the republic. For apart from the community and women and children, the other things he assigns it are the same both for both regimes. Education is the same as is the life of abstention from necessary work and of common messes. Only here he asserts that there should be common messes for all women as well, and that the number of those possessing arms should be 5,000, whereas there is a thousand there. This is note 31. This is note 31. This goes here. And again, that talks about the guard in the Republic. Women are included in common messes and male guardians and laws. They are assigned separate masses on the size of the citizen body. See Republic that 423A and the laws 737E, 740A to 741A. So that's he continues that reference there. All the discourses of Socrates are extraordinary. They are sophisticated, original, and searching. But it is perhaps difficult to find to do everything finely. In other words, he says beautifully. In other words, this is a criticism. They're sophisticated, but it's perhaps difficult to do everything beautifully, finely, just nobly. This is the Colossus. With regard to the multitude just mentioned, it should not be overlooked that so many will need the territory of Babylon, or some other that is unlimited in the extent to sustain in endless 5,000 and sustain in idleness of 5,000, and a crowd of women in attendance about them, about many times as large. Now, again, this reference to Babylon. This is regarding. He'll talk about 3.5, but how that's not really a city. But here's, in other words, he's saying, in order to have 5,000 people not working at this and just living in luxury, you need a huge population to do the work and labor and things for them. And it's going to be much bigger than the size of the city, size of huge territory. In that sense, right? Particularly that and of them and the crowd of women and the attendance about them many times as large, right? One basic premise should indeed accord with what one would pray for, right? Yet nothing should be impossible. In other words, now one basic premise should indeed accord with what is prayed, yet nothing should be impossible. In other words, it's okay to have anything that you'd wish for, but you shouldn't wish for things that are really impossible, right? It is said that the legislature should look to two things in enacting laws: the territory and the human beings who inhabit it. Again, that is not clearly said in the laws, but see 704 AFF. So he says there's two things but further, one would do beautifully to add that he should look to the neighboring regions. In the first place, if the city is to lead a political life, a way of life, and not one of isolation. Again, 34. Again, this is see Politics 7.1. He refers to his own chapter, book 7. For it is necessary that it uses useful war, the arms that are useful not only on its own territory but in foreign regions as well. So in other words, it has to concern itself not only with the people and the territory, but also their neighbors, and what kind of weapons and arms you need, not only to deal with your own situation, domestic security, but also against your neighbors, right? But if one does not accept this way of life either as one, pardon, if one does not accept this way of life either as one's own or as the common way of life of the city, still men should be formidable to their enemies, not only when these enter their territories, but also when they leave it. So in other words, he's saying that even if the way of life is not something that you want to say it's as good in its own, it should be formidable. It should not be only as formidable coming in, but also formidable when they leave it. Okay. As regards the aggregate of property, 2, one should see whether it would not be better to determine this difficulty and more clearly. For he asserts that there should be as much as needed to live with moderation. Again, that's he says that from the laws. Again, the footnotes always put to the word, which is as if one were to say to live well. It is too general. In other words, he needs to be more specific. His argument, yes, it's moderation, but he says as though he's talking to live with moderation, as though it means to live well. Moreover, it is possible to live with moderation, but wretchedly. In other words, he's even saying that, listen, it's not, he thinks the assumption is living well and living moderately is the same thing. It may not be, because he says right here that living moderately may mean literally just living wretchedly, right? A better defined principle would be with moderation and liberality. For when separated from one, the one will tend towards luxury, the other towards a life of hardship. So therefore, moderation and liberality need to be tied to each other. Moderation, liberality without moderation, luxury, and moderation without liberality becomes something mean or harsh. Um, since these alone are choice-worthy dispositions concerning the use of property. So in other words, moderation and liberality are the choice-worthy things. It is not possible to use property gently or courageously, but it is possible to use it with moderation and liberality. So the disposition connected, so the dispositions connected with it must be these. In other words, you can't use. He makes the question of the dispositions of man, the virtues, right? You can be liberal, you can be uh, 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 moderate, sophosune, right? The kind of sound-mindedness or moderate, temperate, right? And then the other one is what? Courageous, and then gentle, and he says that gentle and courageous doesn't make sense for moderation, use of property, the use of property and use of wealth, whereas moderation and liberality do make sense, right? It is also odd that while property is equalized, nothing is instituted regarding the number of citizens, but procreation is left unrestricted on the grounds that it will remain sufficient, close to the same number through childlessness on the part of some, no matter how many births there will be, because this is held to be the result in cities now, right? This idea that it's going to be things, and this is like again he points to where the laws that line is, and so therefore he says that he doesn't deal with the question of birth rates and and doesn't care about the question of procreation, because there's a problem here that if the city grows too big, it's going to lead to inequality, okay? And it's going to be a problem about this. Now, he thinks that in the laws, the question is, well, things are going to stabilize no matter what. It's kind of like an assumption that, well, the ones who they're going to be those who have children, those who don't have children, and therefore it will average out in the end, right? And he uses the example of how this results in cities now, right? But the precision this requires is not the same there as in cities now. For now, no one becomes poor on account of the splitting of properties to accommodate any of their heirs. But there, as properties are indivisible, persons who are surplus must necessarily have nothing, whether they are more or fewer in number. In other words, his saying is the city is that it's because the properties can't be divided, and because they can't be divided, um, what ends up happening is what happens is the current cities is property gets divided, things that comes up, so there is this kind of mechanism. But there in that ideal city of the laws, he's going to not going to allow property to be divided, and therefore it's going to have a problem. One would suppose that procreation should be restricted sooner than property, so that they would not be births beyond a certain figure, and that the whole number would be fixed by looking at the chances of some of those born dying, and of the childness and parts of others. In other words, he says, well, you should deal with procreation sooner than property. It's in that sense, right? And then therefore, some people will point to this point and say Aristotle believes in abortion. George Anastopoulos used to say that. I kind of Aristotle is agnostic on the question of abortion. It's a question of its usefulness. His argument would be. Again, he's not a Christian in this sense. He doesn't, or Jew or a Christian, which believes in God, a divine being whose gift of life. He does think life is meaningful, but not all life is equally meaningful. Whereas the Judeo-Christian conception, or the biblical conception, which all the monotheistic religions derive from Abraham. The Abrahamic religions all preached in the sacredness of this. This is, I don't want to get into an argument about that, but there is a, I know some people on the Christian rights. Oh, there's no such thing as Judeo-Christian. Yes, there is. It is a common. We go beyond the Jews, but the Christians go beyond what the Jews say because their revelation is more specific of Christ revealing himself to who he is, and the Jews do not believe who Christ is, right? And the Muslims have a different perception. They just take the Jewish position and go a little further with it and make that the prophet is, they speak of the new prophet who fulfills the other prophets. There's no, like the Jews, they don't believe the Christ is God. They believe he's the only the prophet, right? So they are differences between these religions. That's true, but they share the same. They share a lot of the commonalities of the specific value of the individual, where the Greek world and the Roman world and the pagan world doesn't necessarily do that. So there is a fundamental ontological difference between the Christian and the what we call the monotheistic Christian world, which has even a cosmology that understands that God is outside of being and super being and is the creator of everything and not therefore part of it. Whereas the gods most of the gods are just super beings in the worlds of the of the non monotheistic religions of you show they're super beings that are greater with more power, omnipotence, or some ability to manipulate nature to some degree, not a not beyond it, not its creator in that fundamental sense. They might be shaping it and reshaping it and knowing how to manipulate it, but they're not that. So I mean, that little discussion of that was only there to kind of point out why the abortion would be not as much of an issue in that sense. Um, but again, I should be concerned about this. It's easier to deal with the question of the number of children than it is to deal with the question of property, how to handle property in that sense, right? To leave it alone, as in most cities, must necessarily cause poverty among the citizens, and poverty produces factional conflict and crime. In other words, this is the idea is that one of the things that emerges is that that poverty, inequality in poverty is a production of stasis, factional conflict, and crime. The argument is right. Poseidon of Corinth, one of the very ancient legislatures, in fact supposed that the household and the number of citizens should be kept equal, even if the allotments of all were originally unequal in size. In the laws, it is just the opposite of this. So, in other words, he talks about an ancient lawgiver, Phaedon of Corinth, and he argued that the household should be equal numbers, right? Even if they were, in other words, you should try to get all the households to be equal. Now the laws make the opposite of this, and even if they were originally unequal size, right? In the laws, it is just the opposite of this. But these matters and how we suppose they could be better handled, we'll speak of later. And that's this. And this is, I think, is 37. Again, this is his discussion in book 7, chapter 10 of his discussion of book 7, which is his city, the city that one would pray for. Okay, this ideal city that he'll give. So Aristotle will give an ideal city, a one that you would pray for, but it's going to be addressed in book 7 later. Now the question is we're going to get past book 3, we'll address that. There is a problem as we get the ordering of the books. Should 7 and 8 come immediately after book 3, or should 4, 5, and 6 come after book 3? So therefore, this is a big fight in how do we understand. And I think Aristotle purposely leaves us. I think the argument is that it's left ambiguous, and both are possible. And I would argue when we get to book three, we'll talk about that three is kind of the center. Book three and its focus, the regime, will be the center that keeps the whole politics together, right? Uh, okay, now, but omitted in the laws is the matter of the rulers and how they will differ from the rule. In other words, he doesn't deal with the question of how the rulers and the ruled how they differ and how they, for he asserts that just as the warp is made of a different kind of wool from the wolf, so the ruler should stand with respect to the rule. Now, this is again 38, which he deals with this. This is at laws 734E to 35A, right? He points to exactly where in the laws that's said. And since he permits the whole of one's property to increase as much as fivefold, again, he cites the place in the laws, why should this not be allowed up to a certain point with respect to land? In other words, if property and wealth can increase fivefold, why not land? He says, it needs also to be investigated whether the separation of housing sites is not disadvantage for the household management. For he assigns two housing sites to each individuals and make them separate the district. Yet it is difficult to administer two houses. Now, 40. In other words, again, he's talking about laws. The second house is intended for use of his married son, right? The argument goes. Uh, it's going to remember this criticism here. Remember, all the criticisms he makes here, we have to hold his own account later too. So remember this. So pay attention to what he said here about this, about that. Oh no, that it's not a good idea to have two housing sites administering them separately, and yet it's difficult to administer two houses. Right? He says the organization of the regime as a whole is intended to be neither democracy nor oligarchy, but the one midway between them, which is called politeia, okay, regime. Lord translates this as polity, but the Greek word is politeia, which is the same word politeia, so which is called the regime. So you can read to say, but the midway between them, which is called a regime. For it is based on those who bear heavy arms. This is, again, this is 41. This is hoplites. The word is the hoplites. The heavily arms are called the hoplites, right? On hoplites. Um, in other words, it's based on those regimes that are called heavy arms. Now, if he institutes this, okay, he now if he institutes this as being the most attainable for of all the regimes for the city, he has perhaps argued beautifully. But if finally, right, beautifully, Cologne. But if as being the best after the first sort of regime, then not so. So again, this is 42. This is laws. This is the question. In other words, it's the question. If he's arguing that this is the best that you can happen, right? This is the best uh, 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 for cities, the most attainable for all cities. He's argued beautifully. But if he's saying it's the best after the first sort of regime, then not so. For one might well praise that of the Spartans more, or some others that is more aristocratic. Now there are certain people. Okay, this is 43, and it's not who this referred to. There's certain people um, who say that the best regime should be mixture of all regimes, and who therefore praises that of the Spartans. Right, this idea there must be all type. This mixture, there must be a mixture of this, and that this is someone who praises this in that sense. And again, this is not known who that person is. Some of them assert that it is a mixture of oligarchy, monarchy, and democracy, calling the kingship monarchy the rule of the Senate Senator's oligarchy, and saying it is a democratically run by the virtue of the rule of the overseers. The overseers, again, 44. This is the Spartan overseer, the Ethroi, were a board of 5 men with powers considerable to Roman tribunes. It says, see chapter 9 for the Spartan system generally, right? The Ephors. Overseers, the Ephors, on account of their overseeing being drawn from the people. But others call the board of overseers a tyranny and find it democratically run by virtue of common messes and the rest of their everyday life, way of life. Okay, so therefore, this idea it's in other words, these are not democratic overseers, but tyranny, but rather call the overseers a tyranny and find it democratically run by the virtue of the common messes, right, and the rest of their ordinary life. So therefore, this and again, I would argue there's another one. Even though it's not known by Mr. Aristotle. Um, Hundreds of years later, sometime a little later than him, um, after he's dead and not there, but at least 100 years. Polybius' account of the Roman Empire in chapter book 8 of his history, gives the account of Rome, and it repeats this argument, this division here of the argument. Now the question is, Polybius does not. It is not proven. I don't think Polybius read Aristotle, or if he read Aristotle, he only read the ethics and the rhetoric, not the politics, because Polybius is going to be one of the people that follows Plato's account of the circle of regimes, right? The cycle, the autocyclus of the cycle of regimes in that sense, which Aristotle in book 5 we'll see rejects. So that who's the somebody? Maybe can say he foresaw Polybius. Well, it is. I mean, Polybius is someone who could say who argues that Rome is this mixture, right? Or maybe there is someone who says we don't know of about Sparta this way. Okay, so let's continue now. Number 18. In the laws, on the other hand, it is said that the best regime should be composed out of democracy and tyranny, which one might regard either as not being regimes at all or the worst of them all. In other words, that it must be a combination of democracy and tyranny. 45, again, this is at law 693d. Actually, Plato speaks here of monarchy, not tyranny. Well, I disagree with the Lord. He says, speaks of it as, a tyranny. I think, give me a young tyrant. Give me a young tyrant. That's what he says. And these are not the best regimes, but they're the worst of all. Even democracy that is like run radically, in a sense. More nearly right then are those who mix more of the regimes. For the regimes that is composed out of more is better. In other words, the argument is that there's mixture. In other words, this is where the mixture argument starts coming into play. Again, the mixture argument is the big point of contention in many places here. So, and later in book 4. So the mixture counting. Sorry, I need to keep on doing some things. I keep on getting attacked by Papa messages. So therefore, he says that the regime is composed out of more better. So therefore, this argument for mixture, right? So he says that yes, the idea of mixture is a good idea, and I think in book 4 he will go on to more detail about that. But let's continue. Actually, though, the regime of the laws manifestly lacks a monarchic element. Its characteristics are oligarchic and democratic, although its tendency is to uh, uh, incline more towards oligarchy. So what's he saying? This is clear from the setting of selecting officials. Again, this is 46, which laws, he talks about the way the officials are set. This is, again, all very oligarchic, he argues. Selection by lot from among the persons previously elected is common to both oligarchy and democracy. But for those who are better off to be compelled to attend the assembly, vote for officials, and perform other political tasks, while the others are let off, is oligarchic, as is the attempt to have the majority of officials among the well off, and the greatest officials from among those with the greatest assets. Here he also here also he makes election of the council oligarchic. It is compulsory for all to elect from the first assessment, and then from the second in equal numbers, and then from the third, except it is not compulsory for those from the first and the second to elect from the fourth. Then he then says that from among those elected in this way, they should designate an equal number from each assessment. Hence, those who are from the highest assessments and the better will be more numerous, since some from the popular classes will not elect because it's not compulsory. Now, 47, he continues here, or the text from, this is another translation of this, those who are from the high assessment will be more numerous and better. Okay, right? This is the question of this, and better, since the popular classes will not elect because of it's not compulsory. 22, and this is the last paragraph of chapter 6, that a regime of this sort should not be constituted out of democracy and monarchy, then, is evident from these things and from what will be said later with regard to with the investigation turns to this sort of regime. Okay, now 48. This is with reference appears to be at 4:7 chapter book 4 chapter 7 and 9. Now, also with regard to election of officials. Again, this will be, he'll talk about the question of what is this structure of mixture here. Also with regard to the election of officials, it is dangerous to have them elected from persons previously elected. For even if readily few are willing to combine, the election will always take place in accordance with their wishes. This then is the way matters stand concerning the regime. He ends the discussion of the regime of the laws. Let's so therefore here we end the discussion of the laws. He's very critical of it. He says, this discussion of mixing that he thinks he approves of, but then he thinks the idea that one should mix is do this, and it's a big question. What is meant by mixing? I think he will argue that all regimes are really ultimately mixed, because the mixture is that of the population. There's not going to be a community that is composed, because every type of regime is reflected on the different elements. You're not going to have a city that is so homogenous of the same type of people that they are going to be all the same class. In other words, that it's going to be unlikely that you get a homogeny of people so being so similar and so identical to each other that they will not have some aspects of division. In other words, his argument of divisions, that what divides the ways of life will be the kind of ways of life, and there's going to be different. There's going to be some things, ways of life in common, but even within a common way of life, there's going to be differentiations of functionality of what is being done for that way of life, and that's going to lead to differences. Okay, and this is what Aristotle seems to be saying here, in the sense that in other words, there's going to be that the differences between the type of workers will then create interests that will create possible conflict among in the regime, or different viewpoints. The different classes will have different interests, and that therefore these interests will actually lead to situations where they're going to be disagreement, and that's contestation in that sense. This is where contestation happens, and that could be factional conflict in that sense. Stasis, that this could lead to stasis. Um, so this is how he ends this discussion of the laws. He says it's not. He's basically saying uh, it's problematic. He doesn't again, like the Republic. Plato doesn't really deal with the issues that need to be addressed as well as he should. So we'll stop here. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below, and when I see them, I will reply to them and give you things. If you've liked what you said, like it. If you didn't like, you can say that, and please say why. I take criticism. Maybe you can help me get better in that sense. Um, if you like what you think, share this on social media. Share it to a friend. Encourage more people to join. You can subscribe if you want. If you subscribe, haven't subscribed already, subscribe so you get the updates. You know when things are going to be happening. Um, then you can get other people. Please encourage people to subscribe. I'd like to grow a little bit, some more. If you want to follow me on social media, you can follow the links below. If you wish to help me deal with this channel, again, this is subscribe, star, and Patreon. Remember, you can do that. I know that I'm not that great on these things, and I mean Patreon and things like that. If it grows, if there are more, I can do more. Um, um, that's what it is. If you wish to help me, you can always buy my book. I'm not going to keep on talking about this because I think people are tired of it. If you haven't seen it already, then you can go look at another video. It's my book on Lulu. Deals with the notebook on Aristotle's politics, which is basically a study guide. It's cliff notes on the politics. It's not a book that's to be read in substitute of the politics, but it's to be read with it. It's a guide. It's a study guide to help you go through it. It has charts and it has divisions and things like charts and organization, things of the various sections to help you understand it a little better. It's not interpretation. It's just simply just going through text. Again, that's it. I hope you have a good day and take care and see you soon. Bye bye.